Your FAFSA number isn't the whole picture. Hundreds of colleges quietly run a second formula on top of it, and that second formula is the one that decides what you actually pay. Most families never hear about this until the aid offers land and the numbers don't add up. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what CSS Profile versus FAFSA means in practice, why the same income can produce very different aid calculations at different schools, and who actually needs to file both. There's one thing I want you to hold on to as we go through this, something most families get wrong on the first pass, and I'll come back to it near the end. It's the reason two families with nearly identical incomes can end up with aid packages thousands of dollars apart at the same school. We'll get there. Take Miriam. She's in her mid-50s, runs a small freelance consulting business, and her daughter just got into 3 private colleges. Genuinely exciting news, until the financial aid offers came in. Miriam had spent weeks understanding her student aid index from the FAFSA. She knew her number. She thought she understood what she'd be asked to pay. Then the offers arrived, and every single one of them was higher than she expected. Not a little higher, significantly higher. Here's why that happened, and here's why it's happening to a lot of families in 2026 who did everything right on the FAFSA. There are 2 separate systems running at the same time, and most people only know about one of them. The FAFSA uses what's called federal methodology. It produces a number called your Student Aid Index, or SAI. That number is calculated according to federal rules. The same rules for every school that accepts federal aid. It's standardized, relatively simple, and it's what most families spend all their time on. But roughly 300 colleges, mostly private, highly selective institutions, also require the CSS Profile. The CSS Profile is a much longer, much more detailed form administered by College Board, and it drives what's called institutional methodology. Institutional methodology versus federal methodology is the core of this whole conversation. Federal methodology sets a floor. Institutional methodology is what each college actually uses to determine how much of their own money, their grants, their endowment funds, they're going to give you. And the 2 formulas count very different things. Here's where Miriam's situation gets concrete. The FAFSA doesn't ask about home equity. It doesn't ask about the value of a small business if fewer than 100 people work there. It doesn't dig deep into retirement assets beyond what's required.
Miriam owns her home with a modest amount of equity built up over 2 decades. She has a freelance consulting business. Neither of those showed up meaningfully in her FAFSA calculation. The CSS Profile asked about both of them. That's what CSS Profile explained looks like in the real world. It's not just a longer form. It's a different lens entirely. The profile has a field for home equity. It has fields for business value and business income that go beyond what the FAFSA captures. It asks about siblings' assets differently. At some schools, it triggers a request for the non-custodial parents' financials, even when the FAFSA doesn't require them. And each college that uses the profile has the right to customize how they apply it. So the same profile data can produce a different expected contribution at each school. That last part is the one that catches families completely off guard. When you file the FAFSA, there's one federal formula, one SAI. Every school sees the same number. The CSS Profile doesn't work that way. When Miriam submitted her profile, her daughter's 3 private colleges each ran their own version of institutional methodology on the same data. One college weights home equity at a full percentage rate. Another caps it. A third uses a different formula for self-employment income. She got 3 different expected contributions from 3 different schools, and none of them matched her FAFSA SAI. This is the thing people mean when they ask about CSS Profile versus FAFSA. It's not just 2 forms, it's 2 philosophies about what a family can afford. Now let me answer the practical question you're probably sitting with. Do I need the CSS Profile? If you're applying to public universities, state schools, the answer is almost certainly no. Public schools rely on the FAFSA and federal methodology. Your SAI is what drives aid decisions there. If you're applying to private colleges, check every school's financial aid page individually. Look for CSS Profile Required or Institutional Methodology. About 300 schools use it in 2026, and the list includes most of the schools with the largest endowments, which also tend to be the schools that can afford to give the most generous aid when you qualify. Filing the profile isn't bad news. It means there's potentially more institutional money on the table. But you need to understand how the formula works before you assume the aid offer will be lower. There's also an important detail about timing. The CSS Profile typically opens in October for students applying in that admission cycle, and many schools that use it have earlier priority deadlines than FAFSA-based schools.
Missing that window doesn't just mean a smaller aid package. At some schools, it means no institutional grant consideration at all. So the what is the CSS profile question isn't just conceptual. It has a deadline attached to it. Here's something that surprises a lot of parents in Miriam's situation. The profile's broader scope doesn't automatically mean a worse outcome. It means a more complete financial picture.
If you have circumstances the FAFSA doesn't capture, a medical hardship, a recent income drop, a business that looks valuable on paper but doesn't generate much cash, the CSS profile's more detailed framework, combined with a professional judgment appeal, can sometimes work in your favor. The FAFSA is a blunt instrument. Institutional methodology has more surface area. More surface area means more places where your actual situation can be heard. And this is where the appeal process becomes critically important for families like Miriam's. Because once you understand institutional methodology, what it counts, how home equity gets weighted, how business income is treated, you can write an appeal that speaks to those specific factors, rather than arguing against a number you don't fully understand. I've put together the tools for that in the pack at FAFSA-appeal.com. There's a CSS profile survival pack that walks through the asset categories the form is most likely to surface from your return. And there's a companion tool specifically for non-custodial parent situations, the NCP Waiver Decoder. Because that's one of the places where families get blindsided most often, and where the right documentation can genuinely change an outcome. Now, here's the thing I told you I'd come back to. The reason two families with nearly identical incomes end up with aid packages thousands of dollars apart at the same school. It almost always comes down to assets the FAFSA never asked about. Home equity is the biggest one. A family that rents has a very different profile under institutional methodology than a family that owns a home, even if their adjusted gross incomes are identical. Same principle with business ownership. A consulting practice that grosses $60,000 a year can look very different on a CSS profile depending on how business assets are reported alongside business income. Miriam's situation is a textbook version of this. Her FAFSA SAI reflected her income. Her CSS profile reflected her income and her home equity and her business. The gap between those two numbers, that gap is what produced the surprise in her aid offers. Understanding what is the CSS profile is partly about the form itself.
But it's really about understanding that colleges using institutional methodology are trying to construct a fuller financial picture than the federal form provides. They're asking, what does this family actually have access to beyond what shows up in adjusted gross income? Once you understand the framework, the question stops being, why is my aid offer so low? And starts being, what specific factors are driving this? And is there accurate documentation that tells a more complete story? That's the shift that makes appeals work. And that's what we'll keep building on in the other videos on this channel. If this helped you understand the two-formula system, a like genuinely helps YouTube put this in front of other families trying to figure out the same thing. And there are more videos here digging into the CSS profile piece, the non-custodial parent question, the appeal process, all of it, whenever you're ready to go deeper. You filed the FAFSA. That was the first formula. Now you know there's a second one, and you know what it's looking at.